So there's a UNC amendment.
No, why would they
until you lay amendments?
Those are personal amendments.
Listen, we had discussed the case law on the floor the last day. Don't be frightened, don't be frightened. Don't be frightened.
I'm not frightened. You ever know me? Well, I'm saying that's right.
The Honorable the President.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the supreme being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Oath or affirmation, announcements by the President, bills brought from the House of Representatives. 1. The Criminal Division and District Criminal and Traffic Courts Bill 2018 in the name of the Attorney General. 2. The Payments into Court Bill 2018 in the name of the Attorney General. 3. The Miscellaneous Provisions Supreme Court of Judicature and Children Bill 2018 in the name of the Attorney General. Petitions, papers.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in the name of the Minister of Finance. The report on the operations of the National Insurance Board of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year ended June 30, 2017. The annual audited financial statements of Invest TT for the financial year ended September 30, 2017. The annual report of First Citizens Asset Management Limited for the year 2017, and the annual report of First Citizens Bank Limited for the financial year 2017. Thank you, Madam President.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following paper as listed on the order paper and supplemental order paper in the name of the Minister of Education and in my own name. The administrative report of the MIC Institute of Technology Limited for the period October 1st, 2014 to September 30th, 2015. The ministerial response of the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries to the 16th report of the Public Accounts Committee, 3rd session 2017-2018, 11th Parliament on the examination of the audited financial statements of the Trinidad and Tobago Electricity Commission for the financial year 2012 to 2015.
Reports from committees.
Senator Amin.
There's only a report. Madam President, I have the honor to present the following report as listed in the order paper in my name. The 8th report of the Joint Select Committee on Local Authorities, Service Commissions, and Statutory Authorities, including the THA. 3rd session, 2017-2018, 11th Parliament, on an inquiry into the efficiency and effectiveness of the Statutory Authorities Service Commission.
Urgent questions, questions on notice, questions for oral answer.
Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I wish to announce that the government will be answering questions number 140, 142, 143, and 172.
Senator Mark.
Yes, repeat first 140.
Yes, 140, 142, 43, and 72.
Okay, thank you, Madam President. Question 140 to the Minister of Health.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, in order to mitigate this potential risk, several measures are being implemented to prevent the spread of malaria throughout Trinidad and Tobago. These include: 1. The proposed establishment of a travel health clinic at the Insect Vector Control Division, the IVCD, for suspected cases to access treatment for malaria using the microscopic diagnosis. This technique is highly recommended by the World Health Organization, the WHO, and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, as the gold standard for laboratory confirmation of malaria. 2. The increased surveillance with the use of 52 malaria evaluators throughout the country at various health institutions and legal ports of entry into Trinidad and Tobago, both seaport and airport, and to conduct house-to-house surveys in high-risk areas to detect and treat individuals demonstrating symptoms suggestive of malaria. 3. The recent establishment of a cabinet-appointed interministerial committee to respond to the threat of malaria by providing oversight and developing policies, strategies, advice, and directions for the prevention of malaria re-establishment and strengthening capacity to respond to malaria. 4. The ongoing sensitization and consultation with key stakeholders within the health sector. 2. 1. Provide an update on the threat of malaria. 2. Highlight key elements of malaria case management. 3. Formalize standards for reporting on on suspect and confirmed cases of malaria. And 4. Identify training needs for healthcare workers as it pertains to malaria case detection, management, and surveillance of malaria. And 5, Madam President, the ongoing vector control measures include: 1. Indoor residual spraying and ultra-low volume spraying at high-risk homes, communities, and workplaces. And finally, routine perifocal work throughout the country so as to identify breeding sites of Anopheles mosquitoes and facilitate source reduction.
Senator Mark.
Yeah, through you, Madam President, can the Minister indicate to us which areas of Trinidad and Tobago can be described as high-risk areas for the mosquito invasion of our country as it relates to malaria?
Minister.
Well, Madam President, high-risk areas for mosquito breeding are obviously low-lying areas where there's the accumulation of water, swampy areas, and more importantly, areas where there's a lack of proper drainage. And obviously, there's the whole individual responsibility to have on your property, do not have containers that can hold water and be the breeding ground for mosquitoes.
Senator Rambharat.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, thank you for the opportunity to ask the Minister. Minister, are you aware that the Insect Vector Control Unit, which is located down in Jerningham, has been inoperative for over the past 6 months?
Minister.
I am not aware, but I can seek advice on that matter and respond at a later date.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, can the Honorable Minister advise us who are the members of the Cabinet Inter-Ministerial Committee appointed to deal with this whole matter of the malaria outspread or challenge?
Minister.
Madam President, I cannot recall that off the cuff, but I was a member of the Cabinet who approved this committee, and that information can be provided at a later date.
Well, would you be kind enough to indicate to the President and the House whether you'll be able to provide that later on in the proceedings?
Minister.
I can't promise later on the proceeding, but definitely by the next sitting.
Next question.
Yeah, Madam President, the Honorable Minister talked about sensitization. Could the Minister advise this Senate how many sensitization sessions the Ministry has held in this country since this threat arising out of this malaria invasion?
Minister.
At this point in time, I'm not privy to that answer. And again, this is information that once the question is posed properly, the government can respond.
Next question, Senator Ma.
Thank you, Madam President. Question number 142 to the Honorable Minister of Public Utilities.
Minister of Public Utilities.
Madam President, I am not aware of any real threat by the Postal Workers Union to engage in widespread industrial actions which could precipitate a mail delivery crisis. The management of the Trinidad and Tobago Postal Corporation recognized the importance of consultation and communication in developing and maintaining peaceful industrial relations and has been in constant dialogue with the union. Moreover, since assuming office as Minister of Public Utilities, I have met with several of the workers' representatives from the state agencies under my purview, including the Postal Workers Union, to promote a shared vision for the management of these entities. These discussions have been very productive and fruitful, and I have found the positions of the union to be very reasonable and responsible. I am satisfied with the collaborative relationship which exists between the Trinidad and Tobago Postal with TT Post and the Postal Workers Union, and the consultative arrangements in place to resolve industrial relations issues. Given the ongoing dialogue between both parties on outstanding industrial relation issues, there is no need for my intervention at this time.
Senator Ma.
President, can the Minister indicate what are the mechanisms that are in place to address industrial relations matters involving the postal management and the Postal Workers Union? Could you share with us what are those mechanisms?
Senator Mark, I won't allow that question, but you continue to ask. You have another supplementary.
Oh, I see. He did mention mechanisms, so that is why I sought to clarify. Can the Minister indicate, Madam President, whether there are any outstanding industrial relations agreements that may have led to this threat of industrial action that are outstanding between the parties, management and the union?
Minister.
Madam President, as I said, first to begin, I'm not aware that there is any major imminent threat that is being so. And at this point in time, I am not aware of any outstanding industrial relations issues or any pressing industrial relations issues. I know the management has an arrangement and they are in dialogue with the union on a number of varied issues, but none of which poses this point in time an industrial threat or crisis as being put forward.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Yeah. Question 143 to the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, persons from endemic countries suspected of the transmission of malaria in the first instance are screened for signs and symptoms of malaria at ports of entry. When positive signs are detected, these persons are referred to the County Medical Officer of Health and/or the Insect Vector Control Division for the requisite tests for malaria to be conducted in conformance with the 2005 International Health Regulations.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, in light of the fact that 30% of the cases that we have discovered in the Latin America, South America area in particular, seem to be located in Venezuela, and we do have an invasion of Venezuelans here. Can the minister indicate to us whether the government, through the ministry, has been able to isolate any cases of malaria coming from that South American country through its citizenry who are coming here?
Minister.
Madam President, I am not in a position to answer that supplemental question at this time, but I will seek guidance on the relevant information to respond at a later date.
Senator Mark.
Well, would you be kind enough? This is a very important matter, Madam President. So I'll ask my honorable colleague whether he can advise you on behalf of us, when he'll be able to provide that information, so we'll be better clarified on this issue.
Minister.
At the next sitting of the Senate.
Senator Ramdeen.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, to the minister, is the minister aware that the port at Cedros, which is the port through which almost all Venezuelans enter Trinidad and Tobago, has no facilities for testing whether these people have contracted or are bringing into the country malaria or not?
Minister.
Again, Madam President, I'm not in a position to answer that. Obviously, I'm not the Minister of Health, but I can seek some clarification on that and provide a written comprehensive follow-up question at the next sitting.
Next question, Senator Obika.
Thank you, Madam President. Question number 172 to the Minister of Education.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the laptops provided by this government will not be given to individual students as previously obtained, but will be assigned to schools for use by students and teachers. That's the fundamental difference of policy. The laptops will remain the property of the Ministry of Education. Students will be allowed to use the laptops in their classrooms for technology-integrated teaching and learning exercises. The laptops will be returned to their secure storage cards after use. Madam President, the Ministry of Education reiterates its resolve to remain responsive to technology dynamism as it provides laptop computers for use by students and teachers in the nation's schools.
Senator Obika.
Thank you, Madam President. Then could the Honorable Minister of Energy indicate as to whether or not this amounts to taking the future of the children out of the school bags, as the laptops are no longer in the school bags of the children, Madam President?
I won't allow that question. Next question, Senator Hussain.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam President, for allowing me. Can the minister indicate whether or not these schools, these secondary schools, are fully equipped with Wi-Fi, because most of the laptops require Wi-Fi to access programs and books online. And I know that this was a manifesto promise of the PNM.
Minister.
Madam President, I'm not sure what ratio of schools do have broadband Wi-Fi or any form of Wi-Fi at all. That information could be researched. But that was one of the fundamental flaws of the previous policy, because you brought a proliferation of laptops distributed to every single student in secondary school, and there was no Wi-Fi access and no broadband access in most of the secondary schools.
Senator Obika. Senator Obika, this is going to be the first and last time that I caution members about shouting across the floor. And to all members, listen to what I'm saying. It's the first and the last time that I will be uttering this caution. Senator Hussain.
Yeah. Then, Madam President, can the minister indicate whether or not these laptops that were purchased by this government, are they subject to any warranties or software protections and malware protections?
Senator Hussain, I won't allow that question. Senator Amin.
Thank you. Madam President, in light of the Minister indicating that these laptops will be kept in schools, can you indicate what program the Ministry of Education has for security of these, special security to secure the laptops?
Minister.
In my answer, Madam President, I said the laptops will be returned to their secure storage cards after use, and most schools, especially secondary schools, do have securities on site 24/7.
I think it's all. Senator Amin.
Madam President, I just want to clarify my question, if I may. I know the Minister spoke about a storage cart. A cart is something you play, right, but that is not a secure thing in terms of a storage area, a locked room, a properly secured room that is of a certain temperature because you can't let it get too much heat and so on.
Minister?
So just to clarify for the Minister, you must have a special area to store those laptops.
My understanding is that all schools that do have laptops that will have to be secured on site do have such facilities.
Business, government business bills, second reading.
Honourable Senators, the debate on the second reading of the following bill, which was in progress when the Senate adjourned on Tuesday, June the 5th, 2018, will be resumed. A bill entitled, An Act to Amend the Land Adjudication Act 2000. Those who have spoken on this bill are the Honourable Faris Al-Rawi, MP, Attorney General, mover of the motion, Senator Wade Mark, Senator Melissa Ramkisoon, Senator the Honourable Alison West, Minister in the Ministry of Finance, Senator Gerard Ramdeen, Senator Khadija Amin, Senator Obika, who was contributing when the Senate was adjourned. Senator Obika, you have 23 minutes of speaking time remaining.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And I trust today members are fresh, so they won't be disturbing me and shouting across during my presentation.
Senator
now, I want
Obika,
to go straight to...
Senator Obika, take your seat, please. Please allow the presiding officer to maintain control of the Senate. Okay? Continue.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I respectfully and humbly and delightfully oblige. I want to turn to a document titled Land Law and Registration by S. Roten Simpson. And in chapter 15, regarding the process of systematic adjudication. The adjudication process, and if you look at section 13 and section 12 of the Act before us, well, which are being amended by the bill before us, you would see several mentions made of compensation. And, Madam President, an integral concept to this is the process by which you set out adjudication areas, whether it be systematic, whether it be sporadic, and of course, there are key characteristics that would really be important when policymakers, and I dare say technocrats, are fulfilling their duty. And one key area is where there is dealing in land. But I want to go to the fourth point that was made, which is where changes in land use or in pattern of land holdings are proposed. And I wish to read this very short paragraph for elucidation. For example, the pattern of land holdings suitable to rain-grown crops may require redesigning in order to make effective use of irrigation, to safeguard individual land rights must be authoritatively ascertained before replanning is effected, or the rights are changed or extinguished. And I want to use the words of the Attorney General there, stick a pin for a moment. All right? I don't know if it's a safety pin or a needle or whatever, but I want to stick a pin and go to an article that should be in tomorrow's Newsday, if it's not in today's, because it was only published 15 hours ago as of printing, so it probably didn't make press time, titled, Provide Lands for Relocation, Proper Compensation. And it's a breaking story on Tobago. Now, Madam President, for the pleasure of the Honorable Attorney General, I wish to remind him, as when I started just a few minutes ago, that I'm referring to the amendments to be made to Section 13 and 12 of the Parent Act, which are in the bill before us. I welcome interjections. You know, my career is in education, so I welcome interjections. You know? So, Madam President, and as the Honorable Minister of Trade just said, stick to economics. And I thank her for that circumscription, because really and truly I am sticking to fiscal matters regarding my contribution today. Now, the adjudication process, I heard the Attorney General raising 46-1. I don't know if I should sit until he raises it. But, Madam President, as I stuck a pin and I began the article, because the Attorney General wanted some clarity, I continue on to the article, reminding the House that it's regarding the parts of the bill, the parts of the Act to be amended regarding compensation. And I want to read some parts of this article because it's very pertinent to this discussion before us today. Mr. Wolven Lovell, a resident of Bon Accord, is calling on government and the THA to treat with respect and courtesy the residents whose lands they are looking to acquire to build a new airport terminal for the A.N.R. Robinson International Airport. He said the government must provide developed lands for relocation and proper compensation to affected residents. He said that 120 residents will be affected by the government's plan to acquire 84 acres of land. Now, Madam President, this strikes at the heart of this section to be amended, you know, because when you look at the comments made on page 2 in Roman numerals regarding clauses 9 and 10, it speaks to the positions of adjudication officer, demarcation officer, and the procedure for awarding compensation. So I want at this time, and I hope that Mr. Wolven Lovell is listening, you know, because really and truly, what the people of Tobago are crying for should be spelled out in this legislation.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the clause that you're talking about, which is clause 9, is dealing with section 12 of the Land Adjudication Bill. And there's nothing there, as far as I can see, about compulsory acquisition. It talks about damages in terms of a decision made. So can you just either make your point so that I can understand it, or move on, please, okay?
Thank you very much, Madam President. And I'm very grateful for your interjection, because I couldn't have said it better than your good self. Because what you said, Madam President, that it speaks to damages. Now, the point that I'm raising here is that the people of Tobago are raising this issue of damages regarding the compulsory acquisition. So specifically...
So then, Senator Obika, sorry, if you read the Act, both the Parent Act and the bill that is before us, you will see that what you are raising now is not relevant to the matter at hand, okay? So I think you should just move on to another point, please.
I am so guided, Madam President. So what I want to, as I focus on the issue of damages, right, I want to continue, as I stuck the pin, I want to to remove it and finish that very short paragraph that I was reading prior. It says, similarly, the implementation of any measure of land reform will probably entail the systematic ascertainment of existing rights. But here again, it need not necessarily be accompanied by registration of title, however desirable that may be. So, Madam President, the people of Tobago, the people of Trinidad, really and truly needs to get some clarity regarding the issue of damages, regarding the adjudication zones and the process of adjudication. Now, another point I want to go to in the adjudication process is regarding dealing in land, which is what I started with when I rose today, where there is dealing in land. And the sentence that follows from that states, the more dealing there is, the greater will be the need for registration of title, because the primary purpose of registration of title is to make dealing quick, cheap, and simple. And the Honorable Attorney General, in his piloting of this bill, made mention of a cheap process, a simple process, and a process that could be expedited in the public's interest. So this point here is very pertinent, you know? And as we are speaking to the merits and the principles of this bill, it begs the question, because Senator Ramdeen raised it before me, and I'm sure after I take my seat, there will be senators who would raise it again thereafter, which is the process must allow the poor man and woman to have access and to be able to get justice regarding adjudication. So I just want to finish that short sentence. And it also says, above all, certain. So the process of adjudication must be certain. Locally devised processes of private conveyancing will inevitably result in clouded titles and all the misfortunes which flow therefrom. So that's the second point, Madam President. Now, Madam President, I wish to turn to an IDB document, the Inter-American Development Bank. The document is titled A Methodological Framework for Comparative Land Governance Research in Latin America and the Caribbean, written by Joel Sanjak and Michael Donovan, May 2016. Now, a key question that is raised in this document is, are public land allocation and adjudication processes clear and sufficient to meet demands by the poor and by investors? Now, if we look to Trinidad and Tobago and the Honorable Minister of Trade, I just want to make reference to a point the Honorable Minister made, but I also want to make a recommendation. If we are to be speaking to diversification of the economy, Madam President, all right, we must ensure that the adjudication process is sufficient to meet demands of investors as well. And I heard the Honorable Attorney General regarding the process of consultation and the responses of the legal fraternity. However, I have not heard any strong reference regarding the adjudication process by members of the Real Estate Association, the Association of Real Estate Persons, as well as the TTMA and the chambers, the relevant chambers of commerce in Trinidad and Tobago. And I raise that point to make this recommendation, Madam President. I think regarding this bill, given all the recommended changes by Senator Ramdeen, himself a counsel of known repute, given the fact that there may be need to make some further changes in the drafting of the legislation, I think more simple language and clear terms should be fleshed out so the business community who would be significantly affected, especially the persons who deal in this particular legislation, real estate agents, the manufacturers, and the chambers of commerce, they should be made to understand exactly what impacts them and solicit from them, Madam President, solutions or recommendations to any challenges that may so arise from this bill. So I want to continue. The IDB document spoke about governance issues and stated that there are key problems of land governance regarding exclusionary land use regulations, corruption in public and private takings of land, expensive and inefficient processes for registration and adjudication of rights. Now, I made reference to aerial photography, so I won't revisit that section. And I've also spoken about compulsory acquisition, so I won't make reference to that section as well. I want to speak to operationalization and consultation, Madam President. I see the Honorable Attorney General saying again, but I'm sure when I started, nothing I said was heard at the previous sitting. So I couldn't continue developing any of the points. So in operationalization at the ground level is where the private owners, Madam President, the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago who own land, the adverse possessors as well, are going to have some issues regarding this bill and its amendments. Now, squatting communities also will be impacted, and I won't go into that again because that was already dealt with, and persons coming after will deal with in different aspects regarding local government and so on. The actions of the adjudicator could mean that a family can be out in the rain, Madam President. So therefore, really and truly, we believe that this bill in particular, not dealt with as part of omnibus legislation, but this bill in particular should be taken to the public in simple language that the average person can understand and that they can know how it will affect him or her so that when the time comes, they know how to act. Now, Madam President, appointment and general powers. I believe that when it comes to land, and I want to give a story because I want to refer to the contribution by the Honorable Minister of Energy. When the Honorable Minister spoke of, I think it's Douglasville or Douglas City. Right. Now, there's a community in Point 14, Madam President, called Ravine Ranch. And this community, I think it would benefit the Minister of Public Utilities to know that they have some challenges with the water, but that is not the reason why I raised that point. This community would be one of the main communities impacted by this legislation. And I think it would be a novel idea for the government to take their consultations to these communities. Given that persons in these communities may have some fear to come forward given their position as squatters. This being a relatively unsettled squatting community, it's not as settled as ones that would have been before in Strikers Village and so on in Point 14. Going straight to these communities and really identifying the aspects of this legislation that will impact upon them and their lives, and to, even if it means just making them comfortable with certain clauses, but also making them aware of how it can impact them. So that's the suggestion I want to give. I just want to just make reference to this part of my contribution regarding the President's appointment of the demarcation officers. I know persons will come after and say that, so I won't go into that. But I just want to say that the Cabinet should really and truly be careful when they go into that area. So referring to my original article, that is the Land Law and Registration by Roten Simpson, Madam President, is, and I am looking for the drafters of the, I see they are here. And what this article states, Madam President, and I hope the drafters can hear me, is that the first requirement in the process is to decide where systematic adjudication is required. And I'm saying that one formula that could be used in systematic adjudication is treating with new squatting communities as different and apart from established squatting communities, which in actual fact may look like regular landed communities with freeholders and long-term leases, long-term lessors. So that's the other recommendation I want to make regarding the operationalization of this legislation. And Madam President, could you inform me how much more time I have? Respectfully.
5 minutes and about 45 seconds.
Okay. Thank you very much. I didn't realize I was speaking so long. I think it was the vigor of the beginning of my session, the last sitting, really has spurred me. But I want to make 2 short points as I prepare to take my seat regarding the adjudication process. It states here where there is a high incidence of litigation concerning land of a nature that could be...
Senator Obika, you have 5 minutes now.
Okay. Thank you very much. Where there is a high incidence of litigation concerning land regarding boundaries and ascertain interests, the adjudication process should really and truly take that into consideration when they are setting aside adjudication zones. So, for example, there may be an area in Marabella where there was an estate. I don't know if Gopal Lands was an estate before, but I spent some time in Marabella, and I remember that people, the elder citizens, referring to it as some sort of estate. I don't know if maybe the attorneys here would know, obviously, if there are incidents of litigation, they could treat with that part as separate and apart from the other parts of Marabella. For example, maybe Taruba, or maybe be around the line and so on. Now, the last point I want to make, Madam President, is where changes in, where development is being held up or inhibited because of uncertainty or insecurity. Right? This may bring us into the field of customary tenure and the use of systematic adjudication and registration of title for the regulation of dealings, a matter which should be examined. So where development is being held up or inhibited because of uncertainty or insecurity. So that's a wrap up, Madam President. I wish that the drafters of the bill, who I am assuming, given my limited understanding of this aspect of lawmaking, I'm assuming that they would be the persons involved in the regulations. Although from my time in the public service, I know generally there are a lot of persons that are involved in contributing to regulations. Myself having contributed to at one time in the public service. I want to wrap up. Where there is dealing in land, that should be considered in the adjudication process. Where it's desired to use land as security for obtaining credit should also be looked at. So industrial zone should be different from residential. Where there's a high incidence of litigation concerning land and bounds and interests, that should be a separate consideration regarding adjudication zones. Where changes in land use or in pattern of land holdings are proposed. And the last point, where development is being held up or inhibited because of uncertainty or insecurity. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Madam President, thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to join in this debate at this stage. And this debate is on an act to amend the Land Adjudication Act 2000. Madam President, what we are seeking to do today, continuing on the efforts from the last day, we are seeking to make amendments to the Land Adjudication Act, which was debated in Parliament in 1999 and passed, but never proclaimed. And from 1999 to today, this is the 5th attempt to make amendments to the original act, which remains unproclaimed. There was an attempt in 2011, that bill lapsed. 2 attempts in 2012, those 2 bills lapsed. And in our own time, there was a 2017 bill which lapsed, and this is the 5th attempt. And I hope that with all our efforts, it would be a 5th but successful attempt. Madam President, the original act, as we've already found out, stems from a significant amount of work during the 1995 to 2000 period in relation to land law reform, and it followed previous work, particularly leading to the 1981 legislation, which also was never proclaimed. But I just want to point to that particular period in 1999-2000, because, you know, sometimes I feel some of us think that we overworked in the Senate. Some of you may be underpaid, but not necessarily overworked. And in that session, which gave rise to the act we are now seeking to amend, there were 92 bills in that session. This fifth session of the fifth parliament, of which 12 were land bills. And I heard somebody previously, thanked the Attorney General and his team at that time. And, you know, we've inherited in this parliament not only outstanding people in the parliament, but successive attorneys general have inherited outstanding legal support within that particular area. I wish it extended across the public service, but I leave that for another day. Madam President, I want to quickly refer to the contributions of three previous speakers before getting into the meat of the matter, as one of my colleagues said last night in the other place. The first is Senator Obika. In summary, to say to him, squatters have nothing to fear under this government. We don't need to take a consultation to point to prove that. I don't imagine there will be further consultations on this bill. But they have nothing to fear, and I'll tell you why later on. To Senator Ramdeen, I thank you for your contribution as usual. We share views on certain things you've pointed out, and I know that the AG will deal with it in his wrapping up. I am at one with you on Pai versus Graham. As recent as April 2018, Justice Margaret Mohammed described it as settled law in Trinidad. I think we understand that. And the reason why I paid very careful attention to what you're saying is because of the way the adjudication of land has been split all over the place in Trinidad and Tobago, and we are creating yet another body. We know that some matters go to the magistracy, in particular ejectment of squatters and dealing with squatters. Some go, and thankfully, some go to the Supreme Court. And I was just reflecting as I went through some of the cases myself in preparation. I was just reflecting on when I came into practice, and it took about 15 years for a land matter to see a trial, by which time you lost files, you lost a document, you lost your instructing attorney, you lost your client, and I'm still surprised sometimes to see some matters with my name from 20 years ago still popping up. And I was surprised, and I think the more recent practitioners would not have an understanding of how fortunate they are that they are dealing with litigation, particularly litigation on land, within a year of filing their claim. And there are so many things in the rules now to prod parties along towards a solution. But I think that we have to be very careful in dealing with this aspect of land adjudication, that we get it right and we do not create the opportunity for further and further litigation. In trying to create something that takes us out of litigation, which is not as bad as it used to be, that we do not create something that leads to more conflict. And the potential for conflict in my contribution on the other bill, the potential for conflict where you are not dealing strictly with legal rights, but you are dealing with equitable interests. The potential for conflict is real, and as draftsmen, we have to make sure that we provide the level of clarity that is required. And in relation to Senator Ramdeen's contribution, Senator Ramdeen referred to a matter, correspondence involving one Anita Haynes. And I feel it's in the public interest, as reluctant as I am to go into any discussion on that matter, I feel it's in the public interest that I say that I am fully aware of the matter involving Anita Haynes. It attracted my attention last year, and I have overcome the hurdles that I encountered. And in April, towards the end of April 2018, I submitted a report on that matter to the Honorable Prime Minister. In relation to Senator Mark's contribution, I had no plan to say anything until Senator Mark went on and on about Ricky Ramcharan. And you know, even as I left the chamber on the last occasion, I had no plans really of addressing the matter of Ricky Ramcharan until I read a very lavish newspaper coverage of Senator Mark's contribution, in which Ricky Ramcharan's name was reported, and specifically in relation to a questionable 40-acre parcel of land. And I feel, Madam President, that I must correct the record, not only for Ricky, but for his family. Let me say this to you, Madam President. Ricky Ramcharan is an outstanding young farmer in this country. He is married to a farmer. They farm in Konopia. And I thought that Senator Mark might have known about Ricky Ramcharan for two reasons. The first is, and I refer to this newspaper report of February 4th, 2014, and I quote, says, on Monday, 3rd February 2014, the Ministry of the Environment and Water Resources hosted its official event to commemorate World Wetlands Day 2014 at the Caroni Swamp Visitor Center. At the event, two Konopia farmers, Mr. Ricky Ramcharan and Ms. Lilauti Gurdas, were awarded for their sustainable farming practices within a wetland environment. Ricky Ramcharan has been farming for 14 years and cultivates watermelon and pumpkin. He has built temporary mud banks to conserve the water in the wetland, which is beneficial to the ecosystem. And on the newspaper report, Madam President, you see the then Minister of State in the Ministry of the Environment and Water Resources, Ramona Ramdial, presenting Konopia farmer Mr. Ricky Ramcharan with an award for sustainable farming within a wetland environment. You see, Madam President.
Minister, please keep the noise levels down. If you have comments to make anybody, make it under your breath, because I'm hearing all of them and they're disturbing me. Continue, Minister.
See, Madam President, for those of us who likes Bertie's pepper sauce, which is one of our famous products in this country, Ricky Ramcharan is one of the leading suppliers to Bertie's pepper sauce. For those of us who may go into massive stores and buy Baigan, also known as Melangen, Ricky supplies that to massive stores. And to me, he's a model farmer, young man. And there's an important point I'll make. Senator Mark is right. I met Ricky. In fact, for those of you who follow my Facebook page know that I meet farmers and I meet my stakeholders on a daily basis. And I also take the time to post on social media where I go, what I do, and who I meet, because I have nothing to hide. And on March 2nd, 2018, I posted for the world to see my visit to Ricky's farm in Monjaloo. And I will tell you, as I walked through acres upon acres over several hours with Ricky, I never touched on state land. Ricky rents his land from private owners and also has a state lease for a parcel of land. I myself asked him, how could you lease a parcel of land that is underwater for most of the year? And the reason I visited that farmer, Madam President, is because it's one of Senator Mark's colleagues in the other place who encouraged me to go and visit this farm, because Ricky Ramcharan was desirous of expanding his holdings so that he could meet other contracts that he's secured to supply fruits and vegetables to the private sector. And I felt, Madam President, I should take my time so that the country could hear and the media could hear, and to understand that sometimes we could be so callous to those who are outside this house and unable to defend themselves in an era where these proceedings are broadcast, they're reported, the press, and we have a sense of responsibility for those people. Madam President, there is a particular section of this bill that really drew my attention. And that is the section I would speak to 6 parts of the bill. But I want to start with this part. And that is a part which is contained in Clause 11 of the bill. And it's buried in one of the subsections of Clause 11, but is a very, very important provision. And that is the provision which accepts from the application of this bill those areas which are declared to be a protected area or forest reserve, those areas which are declared to be an environmentally sensitive area, and those areas which have been identified by the state for public purposes. That, Madam President, is at Clause 11, where Clause 11 seeks to amend Section 16 of the Act. And it's at C7. And this is a very important provision. And let me tell you why, Madam President. I've already pointed out a few things to the AG which I believe he will address in his winding up. But I want to say that when Senator Obika talked about the squatters in Point Fortin, the squatting in forest reserves, environmentally sensitive areas, and places identified for public purposes is rampant in this country. And 2 things are happening by virtue of this bill. This bill makes it clear that the rights which are going to be recognized and preserved and adjudicated upon are not rights in respect of any interest in land, where that land falls in a forest reserve, an environmentally sensitive area, or a parcel of land identified for a public purpose. But Senator Ramdeen raised it, and maybe other people touched on it inadvertently. The issue remains, what happens to those persons who are already in forest reserves, on environmentally sensitive areas, and in places reserved for public purposes? And what we will find, Madam President, is that in several parts of this country, that squatting or illegal occupation is so endemic and so entrenched that the state must continue its process of regularization in order to deal with those people who occupy the land. That is the reality. That is the reality. I know we would all like to have a situation where our forest reserves and environmentally sensitive areas are cleared of illegal occupants and illegal structures, but unrealistic is the word I would use to describe that. It is not going to happen. And as we now set into law that there will be no protection for persons who occupy those areas, it becomes incumbent on the state to protect those areas. And we have not been doing that. And let me just illustrate the importance of what we do today, but also what we have to do in terms of regularization. And I'm only going to deal with one part of Trinidad. And in relation to forest reserves, which is the area I'm going to talk about, we have 34 forest reserves in this country. And I'm dealing with what we call in the ministry the Northeast Conservancy. And it may be better understood as the municipal boundaries of the Sangre Grande Regional Corporation. And when I looked at our forest reserves within the boundaries of the Sangre Grande Regional Corporation, I'll give you 3 pieces of data. The first piece of data I'll give you is that there are 11 areas within the forest reserves in that part of the country. There are 11 areas where we have very intense residential squatting. And the acreage impacted by that residential squatting is 2,664.4 acres. And that is just one part of Trinidad. So in dealing with regularization, because these people have been living there, some for as long as 40 and 50 years. Some are more recent. And I'll even give you an example of a place called Pine Settlement in Sangre Grande. In 2005, when that area was first viewed, this acreage under occupation was about 87 acres. By 2015, that had reached 405 acres, 5-fold over a 10-year period. Because while we were identifying the current occupants and setting things in train for regularization, we were not curbing new squatters. And this is what we have. And on those 2,664 acres, we have a total of 5,809 structures, many of them substantial structures. And of those, 3,549 are residential structures. And I'll give you an example, Madam President. I had cause last week, Saturday, to go to one of these areas, Marcus Avenue in Valencia. And it was the first time I was seeing anywhere in this country a solar panel, 20 feet by 14 feet, attached to one of the houses. And that house is a substantial house, built next to an equally substantial house. And in the meeting I had there were at least 4 or 5 persons from the military in Trinidad. So these are not criminals. These are not criminals. These are citizens of this country who have gone and established illegally substantial residential structures and have established their families in those areas. And the reality is that while our bill seeks to restrict any entitlement and the exercise of any rights, we will continue to have a problem to deal with. And the government has set in train, has embarked yet again on dealing with those who are already there and to whom we would like to convey a proper title to the land. And this, in closing on that point, we're talking about forest reserves, which are people who are in the Valencia Forest Reserve, the Long Stretch Reserve, which is when you're going along the Valencia stretch, you'd see some trees right on the edge, and you will, if you go further in, you would see communities. The Long Stretch Reserve, the Matura Forest, the Milau Forest, and some of those areas, and those are the forest reserves. So when we talk here, when we put this clause, bury this clause in the bill, we're really doing something that, if enforced, if addressed by the people who are outside of this house with the responsibility to enforce the law and contain, then we would have done what we could do. But there remains, and as other speakers have said, there are rights which have accrued. And even if you're not dealing with strict legal rights or equitable rights, when you go into a community and you see a family that has set themselves up in a structure that has reached a level of permanence, it is difficult to turn that back. In relation to environmentally sensitive areas, the Environmental Management Act, Madam President, provides for the EMA to declare an area as an environmentally sensitive area. And so far, we've had 3 areas in Trinidad declared environmentally sensitive areas. Those are the Matura, in the Matura Forest Reserve. We call it the Matura National Park. The Nariva Swamp. I don't want anybody to be fooled into thinking it's this large body of water. It's a massive agriculture and residential community made famous some years ago by politicians who sought to remove the rice farmers from up there and found themselves in the court. And that is the type of, and the Aripo savannas, which of course came into the headlines very recently. But I'll say something about these ESAs, a point that I made outside of this house last week and it was reported. Sometimes people believe that because they see the word sensitive, it means that we must put barbed wire around it and nobody must go in there. And I use the example of the Aripo savannas. The Aripo savannas, which has found itself in a matter currently before the Privy Council, the Aripo savannas is a sensitive area, but it is not an untouchable area. And in the history of the savannah developed part of its reputation as being the site of a U.S. base built in 1942. In fact, it is the construction of the Aripo, of the Fort Reed in the Aripo savannas that made a big impact to cocoa farming on the eastern coast, because the construction drew a lot of the laborers off the cocoa plantations and onto Fort Reed. And many of them never returned but drifted further west. But if you go to the Aripo savannas now, you would see the bunkers and the buildings and so on. But you will also see in the Aripo savannas substantial residential structures. And very few people talk about that. They talk about the birds and the lagoons and the trees and so on, and they never talk about the families who live there and the families who seek to live there almost on a daily basis. And it may surprise you to know that the Aripo, because you see this, the bill talks about protected area of forest reserve, and in the next subclause talks about environmentally sensitive area. Well, there are 2 designations for Aripo. There is a larger area called the Aripo Savannas Protected Area, a portion of which is an environmentally sensitive area. And I was quite taken aback with the noise about the construction of the roadway, highway from Komoto to Manzanilla, which happens to pass on the edge of the Aripo savannas. And I was quite taken aback because I wondered, why wasn't there any objection when that Valencia bypass road went through the Aripo Savannas protected area? In fact, in doing an exercise now, I have made a request to the Environmental Management Authority for a copy of the CEC for the construction of the Valencia Bypass Road so that I could put all the information before the Cabinet in relation to a regularization exercise. But I would not be surprised to find out that no CEC was granted for that.
Never applied for.
So on the one hand, there is a lot of noise about the Komoto to Manzanilla section passing on the edge of the Aripo Savannas environmentally sensitive area. And nobody talks about the Valencia Bypass Road, which is a very good road, passing through the Aripo Savannas protected area, and whether in fact there were any environmental conditions attached to that construction. So again, to avoid a situation of persons going onto an ESA in Matura, Nariva, Aripo, or any other area to be declared as an ESA, the bill before us says that no rights will accrue. But again, I say, we have a situation of dealing with persons who are already there. And when you get to Nariva, for those of you who have been there, every government has been challenged. Every environmentalist has been challenged with Nariva. But the reality is that people have to live on these sites and earn their living, and we have to operate in a way that people can earn their livelihoods and we can still manage sustainably. And when we come to the last area, which is for a public purpose, well, many of you will be surprised to know that if a parcel of land is identified for a public purpose, how could anybody squat on it? Well, we recently, as a government, took a decision to proceed with the construction of a headquarters for CAFA and the Chemistry, Food and Drug Division of the Ministry of Health. We took that decision in 2017. It's a project supported by the United Nations. 2017. And that is being constructed in close proximity to the Valsain Teachers College, the former Valsain Teachers College, now under the UTT brand. And it's being constructed on the corner right there of the Southern Main Road and the road going to the Teachers College. And you'd be surprised to know that in 1979, that site was acquired through compulsory acquisition from the state from Caroni Limited. At the time, Caroni Limited was not a state enterprise. And the government of the day had to acquire that site. And from 1979 to today, no construction has taken place on it. At that time, it was acquired for the purpose of establishing some workshop facilities for the Ministry of Health. So you will find in our country that we acquire land and for a public purpose, but we take a while to use the land, and somebody may go on it and establish themselves. And what this bill seeks to do is to continue to protect the interests of the public so that site may be preserved for the public purpose for which it was acquired or for which it was designated. And I thought that I should spend some time dealing with those areas, because I think it is very important in this bill, in other bills that we may consider. And it is very important, as we have heard since the property tax and devaluation bill, and we've heard in the bill which we dealt with before this one, the recurring question and the recurrent issue of squatting in Trinidad. And I thought I should say very clearly that this, if properly administered going forward, will protect some of our lands which require protection. But we remain with issues which have to be dealt with. And in relation to something that the AG may address, I want to just say, Madam President, that we have four particular designations here: forest reserves, environmentally sensitive areas, protected areas, and land reserve for a public purpose. But I want to say that yesterday, I was extremely pleased on behalf of all of you to receive a report which is titled the National Protected Areas System Plan for Trinidad and Tobago. And this work has been undertaken through financing from the European Union, the FAO, and counterpart funding and resources from the government of Trinidad and Tobago. And Madam President, I received it yesterday, and I wouldn't tell you what I was doing. I received it yesterday and read it because I thought I wanted to share very quickly some of it. But what this proposes, it reflects on at least 3 major attempts in our country's history to deal with environmentally sensitive areas, protected areas, forest reserves, and all those things. And it once again gives us a plan, a legislative agenda, a way forward. And I really hope that we could get it done. But one of the things that comes out of this is a long-standing discussion on not just having environmentally sensitive areas, protected areas, and forest reserves, but having other types of designations so that we can cover all the issues. And I'll give you an example. Madam President, when we talk, you know, I always have a story to tell. When we talk about squatting, I'll give you a story. On Good Friday, which happened to be Good Friday and Spiritual Shouter Baptist Liberation Day, I thought I should go up to Fort George, which is a site of the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries. I thought I should go up there and see what was happening. And I went up there and I spent some time with members of the public who were there, and I looked at the site and I made observations. And as I was leaving, by the security booth that greets you as you enter the site, I noticed a satellite receiver on the security booth, one of the small ones. I don't know how we call that. How we call that? A transmitter. I caught my attention because at that time I was dealing with an internet bill that surprised me in the ministry. A request from an internet provider to pay arrears of $1.4 million. And I wondered where in the ministry people could be using internet services and not realizing that we are running up a bill. It turns out to be something I inherited. So it caught my attention that we may be running up satellite dish charges and so on. And as I went to the booth, I noticed
Minister, you have 5 more minutes.
I noticed, thank you very much, I noticed someone asleep horizontally on a bed, a television, a stove, a fridge, and it shocked me. And I immediately requested of the Conservator of Forests a report on it, which I subsequently got. And it turned out, under the full watch of people paid to protect the public interest, somebody had established residence in that place. And it occurred to me in preparing for this debate that if that is not an ESA, a protected area, a forest reserve, or a place of public purpose, somebody may accrue rights over a period of time. And I'm saying that to say that in the proposed designations, we would separate out things like the San Fernando Hill, which will be designated a national landmark. It will not be environmentally sensitive or protected because those things require permits to enter. Something like Fort George may be declared a national heritage site or something like that, or a national park. And every designation which will carry with it rules in relation to who can access, whether permits are required, and the behavior on that. And maybe on another occasion, we'll be dealing with a further amendment which allows us to cover all the categories of designations which deal with some of our sensitive lands and sites and so on in this country. Madam President, that is my contribution. I thought I should focus on that particular area. I said there were six areas that I wanted to draw attention to. Those were clauses 3 and 4, where I wanted to to draw attention to the requirement for the surveyors who go on private land to have permission of the owner. I thought I should draw attention, people may miss it, in clause 10, where the surveyors who prepare the demarcation plan are not required to strictly comply with the rules of the Land Surveyors Act, and that means being able to produce a plan with less, in a quicker time, with less bureaucracy. I made the point in relation to clause 11 that what we're doing here by creating all these fancy titles, we are in fact expanding the public service. And I raise my usual caution of dealing with new positions, but also those who implement this must deal with existing positions, so we don't end up with somebody new doing a job that somebody old was prepared to do, and we have somebody still in the system with a title, a salary, and no work to do. And lastly, I wanted to point out clause 17 that deals not only with adjudication matters, but post-adjudication matters. I thank you very much, Madam President.
Mr. Hussain.
Thank you very much, Madam President. It gives me great pleasure to rise on this debate on a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Land Adjudication Act 2000. And Madam President, as most speakers would have indicated, that it took us 18 years to reach this position in which we are now trying or attempting to reform the land system in Trinidad and Tobago. And Madam President, with respect to some of the points raised by Senator Rambharat with regards to the forested areas and the preserved areas and those areas acquired for public purposes, Senator Rambharat, Minister Rambharat, Senator the Honorable Clarence Rambharat, he would have indicated that this bill will actually protect some of the areas in which persons who decide to squat on forested areas and areas that are environmentally protected. But I just want to indicate that we cannot just use this bill alone in order to protect those areas. There must be proper infrastructure with regards to planning and development in this country. And while the People's Partnership Government reigned from 2010 to 2015, we on this side passed the Planning and Development and Facilitation Act 2014 and also laid the National Developmental Spatial Plan also. And those are all policies and framework that have to work in tandem with the Land Adjudication Act that would be passed in the Senate in order to properly manage and plan development of Trinidad and Tobago. And just like Senator Rambharat gave a story, while I was away for 10 days, Madam President, I had the pleasure to visit Washington, D.C. And when you look at the planning that took place there since, I believe, in the 60s, you would be amazed at how properly that they have laid off the infrastructure with regards to housing, business, green spaces, Madam President. And I know that you are looking to me with some confusion, but I will get to the bill, Madam President. And with regards to the policy behind the Land Adjudication Amendment Bill, Madam President, is that what it will do, it will create certainty of ownership, because what this bill intends to do is define persons' boundaries and give them their ownership of land. It will encourage security of tenure. We hope that there will be a reduction of land disputes when these areas are properly demarked. It will improve conveyancing. There will be an ease of transferring land between individuals. There will be a stimulation of the land market, as Senator Obika would have alluded to. It would also support the land taxation regime that this government has embarked on with regards to the property tax. And also, it will facilitate the overall management of the land resources of Trinidad and Tobago, Madam President. And in order for us to do all of this, there are some very important positions that were established through the Land Adjudication Act of 2000 and which are going to be amended by this bill that was laid in this Honorable House. And the first one is that of the adjudication officer. The Attorney General, when laid this bill, will now create the positions of a Chief Adjudication Officer, a Deputy Adjudication Officer, a Demarcation Officer, a Survey Officer, and a Recording Officer. But, Madam President, I just want to focus on two of these positions, and those are the Demarcation Officer and the Survey Officer. And the appointments to these positions are made by the President. And when I read the legislation, the President will be interpreted as the Cabinet of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And the experience that are required for these positions are not outlined anywhere in the legislation or in the bill. So when I look at Section 4 and Clause 4 of the bill also, it reads that the President shall appoint such demarcation officers, recording officers, and survey officers as may be necessary for the purpose of this Act. So therefore, there are no qualifications being given to these persons. But when we look at the parent legislation, there was one qualification, and it was found at Section 4, subsection 9 of the Parent Act, and it says that a demarcation officer and a survey officer shall be a Trinidad and Tobago land surveyor within the meaning assigned to it under the Land Surveyors Act. And this provision was repealed by Clause 4 of the bill. And, Madam President, I want to just go to the Land Surveyor Act, Section 17 of that Act, so that I can elucidate on what are the requirements of a person to be a land surveyor in Trinidad and Tobago. And it reads as follows, that the person must be of good character and reputation and possess the prescribed academic qualifications. And a person shall be registered as a land surveyor if, A, again, he is of good character, reputation, and fit and a proper person to be so registered, possess the prescribed academic qualifications, and has gained such practical experience in a field of surveying as is prescribed or is otherwise qualified as prescribed. And when we look at this legislation, the survey officer and the demarcation officer, who will actually be defining boundaries using geometrics and GPS surveying, they are not required to have any experience whatsoever. So now we have inexperienced persons in these positions, Madam President, who would be defining persons' boundaries as to how much land that they own. And I believe that we should include in this legislation a qualification for the registration of demarcation officers and survey officers simply to fix this mischief, Madam President. And when we look at the type of powers that have been given to the demarcation officers and the survey officers under the legislation, they are given powers to enter persons' property. Now, there's a safeguard with respect to if a person has refused to allow them entry, that you apply for an order of the court. But, Madam President, just recently we passed the Property Tax and the Valuation of Lands Act. And in that act, persons who are appointed as valuators will go around and conduct valuations of persons' homes to determine the assessed market value, rental value. But if we listen to the radio talk shows, we watch the social media, Facebook, and we even hear, just speaking to individuals, there's a fear, Madam President, that persons who are claiming to be valuators are coming and committing crimes, robbing persons, Madam President, so it poses a security risk. And one of the criteria in order to be registered as a land surveyor in Trinidad and Tobago is that person must be of good character. And if these persons are allowed to enter your homes, Madam President, I humbly suggest that these persons, the demarcation officers and the survey officers, also be of persons of good character. Because we live in a time, Madam President, where it's very difficult in order to protect our homes and our lives, Madam President. And I also want to point out some of the duties of a land surveyor under the Land Survey Act. And if I may be allowed to go to Section 22 of the Act, it states that a person shall make and preserve exact and regular field notes, so therefore there's a duty upon them in order to prepare contemporaneous notes so that if they're ever called upon in a court of law, they will be able to produce their notes so that they can have their instructions defined. Now, this is not a requirement of the demarcation officer or survey officer. And if they fail to follow these requirements, Madam President, then by the bill that is before us, they are not acting illegally, because the bill actually states that they can act notwithstanding the provisions of the Land Survey Act, which I believe that should be deleted. When you look at the other duties that they have, Madam President, they talk about they shall survey any holding or land for the purposes of preparing a plan to be attached or to be referred to in any document or instrument purporting to confer, declare, transfer, limit, extinguish, or otherwise deal with, affect any right, title, or interest, whether vested or contingent to or over any holding of land. And Madam President, this is one of the most important duties of the survey officer and the demarcation officer, because one of the functions that they have under the Act is that the demarcation officer must compile a demarcation map. And this map must be prescribed on a scale as a result of the adjudication process, showing the geographic boundaries of each adjudication section and every parcel therein. And again, this requires surveying, defining boundaries, Madam President, and you cannot have someone with no experience who is not registered as a land surveyor doing this type of work, Madam President. It will only breed a lot of issues into the system, because now there would be more land disputes rather than this bill actually addressing a reduction in the amount of land disputes regarding boundaries. And I know Minister Clarence Rambharat, Senator the Honorable Clarence Rambharat, he would have raised the point that, well, the reason behind removing this requirement for the demarcation officer and survey officers not being licensed land surveyors is because of time and bureaucracy. But it may cost us more time and more bureaucracy if we have persons with no training and no experience surveying our lands and preparing demarcation maps with regards to our property and the adjudication of same. And there was another point that was raised by Senator Gerald Ramdeen with regards to the salaries that are payable to the Chief Adjudication Officer and the Deputy Adjudication Officer. And that is found at Section 4, subsection 2 of the Parent Act, Madam President, and it reads that the terms and conditions of the Chief Adjudication Officer and Deputy Adjudication Officers shall be prescribed in accordance with Section 141 of the Constitution. And that Section 141 of the Constitution, Madam President, it deals with the Salaries Review Commission reviewing salaries of persons who hold public office as defined. And I glimpsed at a judgment. This judgment is CA number 52 of 2005. It was a matter involving several opposition members against the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago, a Court of Appeal judgment before Chief Justice Sharma, Justice of Appeal Warner, and Justice of Appeal Mendonça. And Madam President, at paragraph 23 of that judgment, if I may be allowed to quote, it says that Section 141 refers to the functions of the Salaries Review Commission as being to review the salaries and conditions of service. There is nothing in the section which creates an entitlement to salary by a member of Parliament, but that is with regards to the specific facts of that case. But, Madam President, the point that I'm trying to make is that this Section 141(1) does not set the salary of the Chief Adjudication Officer or the Deputy Adjudication Officer. all it gives the SRC powers to do is review the salaries. So I expect that probably in the Attorney General's wind-up that we get some sort of clarification with regards to the salaries that these persons would be entitled to, and also whether or not these persons' salaries would be coming out of the consolidated fund. And there's another issue that I saw with regards to the powers of the demarcation officer. And this was a very interesting power being given to the demarcation officer. And I want to just agree with the amendment that was made to the Act, because it says that the demarcation officer can actually state the compensation that will be given to a person with regards to an adjudication. And the amendment to that is that he does not have the power to set it, but he only has the power to recommend the compensation. But when I looked at the section a little more in depth, Madam President, what that section, what that section actually does is that once he recommends the compensation payable to the aggrieved persons, Madam President, it does not say how this recommendation is made, whether in writing or not. And those things need to be clarified with some more detail. And those are the issues that I have raised with regards to the functions, the duties, and the entitlements of the persons and the positions that are established under the Land Adjudication Act. And I want to move on to one other area with regards to the adverse possession issue under the legislation. And Madam President, Senator Ramdeen would have dealt with the law and the policy and the areas in which he believed that we should fix in terms of the adverse possession. But what I want to focus on is the procedure with regards to this. And if you may allow me, that currently the position is that with regards to lands that have to be brought under the Real Property Act, there are certain guidelines as set out by the Registrar General, and I have a copy of that in my hand, Madam President. And these guidelines give a defined procedure, it gives a defined framework in which a person who is interested in acquiring lands under the Real Property Act that they have to follow in order for the lands to be vested. Now, when we look at the bill before us, all it says is that the person must have been in peaceful occupation of the land for 16 years if it's private lands, or 30 years if it's state lands, Madam President. So it does not give, for example, the requirements, the documents, the evidence that is required to prove same. It does not indicate what the adjudication officer must consider before issuing proper title or recommending proper title for the person who is interested in acquiring the land. And if you may allow me, Madam President, if I can just go through the application process with regards to bringing lands under the RPO, which we can probably fix in terms of making it a bit more tighter so that we can operationalize these provisions within the bill that creates a person's entitlement to gain title under the adverse possession provisions. And Madam President, a person must execute a statutory declaration. They must, it must include their name, date of birth, address, occupation, those normal things. But what is important is that they must actually state the acreage, the situation, boundaries, description of the land affected by the proceedings, and reference to any deed. But that is in this case, there will be no deed because we're dealing with state lands. The local address in which the land is located on, the particulars of possession, the date on which, and the circumstances in which they came onto possession, the names of persons by whom possession commenced, because possession can actually be taken from next of kin, from predecessors in title, Madam President, the duration of his or their possession and the nature thereof, the history of possession up to the time of lodging the application, the nature of the acts indicative of adverse possession. So this would be issues of fencing the land, planting the land, building a structure on the land, how they would have used the land to show that they would have been occupying the land with an intention to possess. And that is one of the lacunas within the bill, which I believe would be addressed at the committee stage. Whether or not they were paying any taxes, because now under the property tax legislation that squatters would be required to pay taxes. If they have birth certificates, marriage certificates, because all of these things show location of where a person is born or where a person is married. Other documents, Madam President. So there's a whole host of information that must be provided to the Registrar General before any lands can be vested to a person under the RPO Act. And I'm saying that all of those are absent in this present construct. Now, what is important is that the surveyor must issue a declaration, and this must state that the surveyor calls a survey to be done on the subject parcel of land on a particular date, surveyor, and that no objections were made, or if there were any objections, stating who made the objections and the nature of the objections, with particular regard to the boundary lines by adjoining occupiers. This must also identify all relevant persons present at the time of the survey. Because under the Land Surveyors Act, if a person causes a survey to be conducted on any particular land, a notice must be given to the adjoining lands indicating the date, time, and who the surveyor would be in order to conduct the survey of this land. Now, in this present legislation, the demarcation officer and the survey officer, they have no duty to provide notices to anyone, or they are not bound to do so, Madam President. They must include survey plans, witness declarations. Those are persons who would be living around the area. And those things are absent from this current bill. And those are very important safeguards. And the reason why those things are actually included in the legislation is so that persons would now not go and make applications and say that I was on the land for 16 years when I was really there for 2 years, or that I'm not even on the land. So there are examiners who would conduct inquiries with regards to whether or not this person has been in possession of the lands or not. And these safeguards, Madam President, protect the state resources, because state lands belong to the state. These are state resources. And one very important safeguard that is also included in the RP Act, which I believe should be transferred to the Land Adjudication Act, is that there must be an advertisement when a person makes an application, because you want to know who is making the application, how much land that they are making the application for, and also give them the power to lodge a caveat in order to give their views with regards to the property that is currently being adjudicated upon, Madam President. And those are the issues that I believe that should be addressed so that we can create some certainty, some procedure when a person wants to assert their rights in order to acquire lands under the Land Adjudication Act, Madam President. And there's one very, very important but can be used as a very dangerous section of this legislation, and that deals with Section 5 of the legislation, Madam President. And Section 5 of the legislation, it gives the power of the minister, sorry, not Section 5, this is Section 3, Madam President. It gives the minister the power by order to declare any area to be an adjudication area from such date as may be fixed, as may be specified in the order. And Madam President, the reason that I'm raising concern with this section is that for far too long, many campaign promises has been made with regards to regularizing land tenure in Trinidad and Tobago. And I do not want a situation where we currently have no idea of where the demarcation areas are or the adjudication areas are. We don't know whether they are going to be defined by local government boundaries, by the entire municipal boundaries, by general election boundaries, Madam President. So we don't know these things, and we are going to pass this legislation. And what is very dangerous is that before any election, the minister can approve or indicate that a certain area where, for example, there are a lot of squatters in a marginal area, for example, and he can go there and say, well, we'll declare this area as an adjudication area. And 1 month before the election, we give every person their title. That is not fair play, Madam President. So I believe that right now, we should actually state where the adjudication areas are, how they are going to be defined, and which areas we are going to deal with first. Because we must plan before we execute. We should not execute and then plan. And I agree with the Attorney General that there's 18 years of analysis paralysis, but sparing us a few hours or a few more days again so that we can get it right, we will move forward in a very comprehensive and a bipartisan, Madam President. So with these issues that I've raised, Madam President, I hope for them to be addressed. So we must know, one, where the adjudication areas are. And I see that Senator the Honorable Clarence Rambharat is smiling. And I know he is smiling because he's a very strategic minister, and he knows exactly where the squatting areas are in this country, and he is the minister in charge of land, right? And also the issues that I've raised with regards to the demarcation officers, the survey officers, the chief adjudication officer, the deputy adjudication officer. So, Madam President, there are several amendments that we intend on this side to address with regards to the current bill and the legislation at the stage of the committee. And I would like to thank you again for giving me this opportunity.
Senator Haynes. Thank you, Madam President, for the opportunity to contribute to this very important debate, which is an act to amend the Land Adjudication Act of 2000. And from the onset, Madam President, please allow me to put on the record from very early on that this opposition has demonstrated time and time again that we are prepared to support legislation that is in the best interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And from the time that I have sat here as a senator, we, as members of the United National Congress on the Senate bench, have maintained a commitment to getting it right and to passing laws that will impact the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago in a positive manner. And it has been my experience, Madam President, that the government will come here from time to time and urge us to pass legislation in an expedient manner, and we would be told that passing the law will in some way equate an achievement. And I would just like to start by disagreeing with that. Passing the law is not an achievement, especially if you have the majority. It's a very simple thing to do. The achievement would be when the law is implemented and enacted properly, and citizens feel the benefits of the laws that we have passed. And it appears, Madam President, that the use of legislation as a public relations tool is not something that we will participate in as a responsible opposition. Because so far, we have had a lot of laws coming before us and being passed, and very little by way of implementation. If you look at trial by judge alone, the road traffic, the plea agreement, and a number of others, where we've come here, we've done the work, and then nothing comes of it. But as we look specifically to this piece of legislation that we are seeking to amend, there is a proclamation clause in the Act, Madam President. And we've had no indication from the Attorney General or the two speakers that the government has chosen to field in, again, what I call a very important debate as to when the legislation would be effective. It seems again, Madam President, we are being asked to participate in what can only be called a national mamagai, right? The opposition has been viciously attacked, Madam President, on the decision taken by the leader of the Senate bench not to debate the land package together.
Senator Haynes, I just want to say at this stage that enough has been said. The decision has been taken that the bills will be heard separately, and let us just proceed. And let's not make any more references to that decision, okay?
Thank you, Madam President. I would just like to say that what we've witnessed, especially in the contribution on this debate by Senator Ramdeen and Senator Mark, that a lot of work had to be done on this legislation. And it took us as well hours to complete the previous bill, showing that the government was intent, I believe, on almost abdicating on its responsibility to create law that would really benefit the people of Trinidad and Tobago.
And Senator Haynes, you are imputing improper motives by proceeding down this line. So I would ask you to start getting into the matter at hand, please.
Yes, Madam President. I had no intention to impute any improper motives at all, so I apologize if anyone felt that I was. So, Madam President, as we look at the legislation and we look at the bill that is before us, and I've looked at it in very great detail, and I know a number of speakers would have raised the powers of the Chief Adjudication Officer and the Deputy Adjudication Officer. And by these proposed amendments, the impact of these two office holders that can have on each and every landowner in Trinidad and Tobago. And quite frankly, Madam President, it is quite concerning to us. And with respect to the amendments proposed in Section 4, and I would just like to read it into the record, that there shall be in Section 4(1)(a), that there shall be such number of deputy adjudication officers who may be recruited as necessary for the respective adjudication areas. And 1(b), that the deputy adjudication officer shall be an attorney at law of at least 10 years experience in conveyancing and shall be appointed by the JLSC. And while we appreciate, Madam President, and we accept that the JLSC affirms a degree of independence, and we on this side will be proposing a number of amendments to do two things. Firstly, and most importantly, we will seek to define the terms and conditions of the Chief Adjudication Officer and the Deputy Adjudication Officer. We will seek, Madam President, to provide in law a high degree of protection from political interference by the executive, and that is any executive. You see, Madam President, no matter who is in power, PNM, UNC, doing the right thing will always remain the right thing. And it is the right thing to do to ensure that as a country, when we as a parliament take a decision to repose these types of powers in a body of persons, that we must really do our very best to ensure that their independence is protected and that they cannot be influenced or coerced by, and again, any executive. And I know that the government gets a little uncomfortable whenever we speak about checks to executive power. And we are told time and time again that we are seeking to whittle down the executive. But every time these things creep up in legislation, we must do our duty.
53(1)(b), please. This is the fourth speaker on that bench to raise the same point on the same clause.
Senator Haynes, I'm going to give you a little leeway, but you have to be aware of the issue of tedious repetition, because I have been trying to influence other speakers. Senator Amin, I am cautioning you to control yourself. From this point, I can hear almost everything. Every sound I can hear. Okay? Continue, Senator Haynes.
Thank you, Madam President. And despite the fact that, again, it seems to be a very uncomfortable area for the government, we on this side will say again that despite the fact that we may very well form the next executive, right is right, and we are suggesting that we take a very good look at what we're doing here. By virtue of, and so Madam President, I would just also like to take a look. I would like to take a look at the Parents Act. We're looking at Section 4, subsection 6, where the adjudication officer shall be competent to administer oaths and take affidavits in any inquiry undertaken by him, and to issue notices or orders requiring the attendance of such persons or the production, this is important here, the production of such documents as he may consider necessary for carrying out the adjudication. And Part 7 says, a notice or order under subsection 6 shall have the same force and effect and be served in the same manner as a summons issued under the Summary Courts Act. These powers, Madam President, when one looks at the Chief Adjudication Officer and the Deputy Adjudication Officer, these orders, the orders that he makes are equivalent to and carries the same force and effect as an order made by the court of law. And so we are virtually, Madam President, setting up a court, a body, Madam President, that is able to exercise similar powers. And it has the power to compel a landowner to produce their documents, and this has an impact on the right to privacy. And every landowner will be impacted by this legislation. So I would just like to put to the Senate that this is a very, very big deal, and that we have to look very carefully and very closely at every action we're doing, because we are in a very serious business of making laws that affect the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And Madam President, we realize that perhaps the government, in its expedience, may not have thoroughly considered the far-reaching implications of this piece of legislation. So if you took the time to understand the nature, the extent, and the ambit of the powers that are being given by these amendments, they can be intrusive in nature to the right of property of each and every landowner in this country. And the government and the Attorney General would have understand that this piece of legislation should require a constitutional majority. And having recognized, Madam President, on our end, that these amendments and this piece of legislation should be passed with a special majority, Madam President, we would be, again, proposing amendments to effect the same. And, Madam President, the government should not fear a special majority. It's nothing to be afraid of. Again, because we have reiterated our position that we are prepared to participate in the mature consideration of every piece of legislation. And that, yes, and that we are prepared to give our support and act responsibly in the best interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. So if your arguments are convincing, and if the government stands firm in its commitment to its policy, then I see no reason to fear a 3/5 majority. I think when we look, Madam President, at Clause 9 of the bill in front of us, and Clause 9 amends Section 12 of the Act by deleting paragraph A and substituting that to award such compensation as may appear to him in substituting the words.
Senator Haynes, no need to read the clause, please. Just give the gist of what the clause is saying.
No problem, Madam President. The purpose of entering the clause into the record is because it also lends to demonstrating the seriousness of what we're called here to do today. And allow me to reiterate, Madam President, that it is incumbent on us as lawmakers to insulate persons that we are giving this wide ambit of power to from any kind of interference, political or otherwise. So I would like to urge caution as we sit here as a Senate, as we think about what is in front of us. Let us be deliberate and cautious in our actions. And as Senator Hussain noted earlier, yes, it has been 18 years, and many, many years have been quoted before that. So a few more hours in careful deliberation cannot hurt. It really is imperative of us to do things in the right and proper way. And I know, Madam President, a number of my colleagues would have raised, and I know that the Attorney General may also raise the fact that there should be nothing to fear because there's a right to object and you can appeal to a land tribunal, and therefore there should be nothing to fear and therefore no need for a constitutional majority. But Madam President, when you think about the most vulnerable in our society, how are they going to avail themselves of this right to object and the appeals? And even as you look at the question of what we're doing here today, a number of persons have raised the issue of consultation, but I would like to raise the issue of public education. You see, Madam President, what we do in the Senate, even though it's widely televised and maybe on the news, etc., not everyone can understand what happens here on a day-to-day basis and on legislation that impacts people's...
Please, same point raised by Senator Obika at length.
Senator Haynes, I know that you are the last person to speak on your bench, and therefore it may be difficult. But if you're going to raise something that someone else has raised, then you need to be very, very brief about it, because tedious repetition is coming up here, okay?
Yes, Madam President. But I was going to take the point on public awareness from a different angle, given that I am in the public relations field, and it was really not to be a targeted hit on the government, but it was really going to be a suggestion. So had the Attorney General allowed me to elaborate on my point, it may have been of some assistance. But, Madam President, if you look at, and I raised the public awareness and public education point, because if you look carefully at what has happened since the property tax has been passed.
I think I have to intervene and ask you to move on to another point, okay? Because you're going down a road that is taking you further and further away from the bill, okay? So try and raise something different, please, okay?
Yes, Madam President. But now my intention here is not to be difficult, but I really do think it is important that we consider, again, landowners are in every class, in every area of our society, and this includes rural areas. So if you look at, Madam President, we're being told that the notices would be published on the...
Listen, whoever that is, please just leave the chamber for 5 minutes. And can I just please implore members to put your devices on silent? And if you don't trust yourself with the knowledge of your device, you should take it off. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. And that was very timely because, as you said, the knowledge of your device, I was about to raise the point that not everyone can use the Ministry of Legal Affairs website. And so we may be wanting to think about where about where the information will be placed. And I know I have, in preparation for my debates, looked at the Attorney General website and the Ministry of Legal Affairs, and I think it is quite detailed, and the information is usually.
It stated that I am giving Senator Haynes some leeway, and I will make the determination when I think enough leeway has been given. So continue, Senator Haynes.
Thank you, Madam President. Quite a bit of legwork today, but what we are saying is that the information provided on the ministry's website, I think, is usually quite good and quite detailed. And when we pass legislation that impacts the lives of people, there can be ways to roll out a public education strategy that will reach persons in every area, every section of Trinidad and Tobago. And it was my suggestion to the Attorney General that once the amendments are made and the legislation is passed, and it really is going to be legislation that we as a parliament can be proud of, that there are ways to get the information to the people that is a cost-effective manner. And I was going to suggest...
I think you've made enough suggestions on that, on what is to happen should the bill be passed. So let's deal with what's in the bill.
No problem.
Okay?
No problem, Madam President. You see, we've been told in the opening remarks from the Attorney General that the bill, that this legislation would be rolled out in Tobago. And when we look at the amendments we are asked to consider in amending Clause 4, in amending Clause 6, and amending Clause 10, the protection that someone has, the protections that we would like to have afforded to persons in this legislation, it seems that would they know what their rights and obligations are under the legislation? You see, we've not been told, Madam President, while we've been told that there has been consultation, no one has detailed where, when, and how. And so we have asked to put our trust in just the word that consultation has taken place, and we would like to also note, Madam President, that the government has 2 MPs from Tobago, and there are a number of senators in here who are from Tobago. And so I would like to ask if legislation is intended to impact the persons of Tobago first. What was done to sensitize the people of Tobago on the legislation? And that was the end of that point. Right? And, Madam President, on this point on working together to pass good law, I'd just like to note that for the first time, the opposition has circulated material to the Senate to assist in the opposition working as a team together have circulated to the Senate information that will assist us as a lawmaking body in taking our responsibility to the nation very seriously and to looking at what we're here to do and how we're here to do it. And so, Madam President, I think at every level in this, despite constant interruptions and being almost, I don't want to run afoul of any standing orders, so yes, but Madam President, in the face of much difficulty, right, the opposition has remained, again, very committed to saying that the principles behind the law is not something that we are opposed to. It's just how it is done. And the manner in which you engage persons in a debate is very important, especially when you desire their support. And so, Madam President, as we go forward with looking at legislation, I would just like to urge the government to approach the debate from the angle that their job is to convince us and the nation that what they intend to do is the right thing and the right way to go about it. It is not an insult for us to challenge or to question the ways in which it is that. I'm President, I'm concluding. Yes. And Madam President, as we go forward with more legislation, there is, in a debate, I think, ample ways for the government to show us that their intentions are good and clear, and they should use those ways. And we, as a very responsible opposition, will continue to act in the best interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And with those few words, I thank you.
Attorney General.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. It gives me great pleasure to address the issues raised by my learned colleagues in this Honorable Senate. I think that this has been a very healthy debate. I wish to thank Senator Ramdeen in particular for not only referring to the case law that he mentioned on the last occasion, but for, in fact, going the extra distance of providing the copies of the cases that he referred to. I think that that's an exceptional step on his part, and I thank him for it. I had the pleasure of pulling them a little bit beforehand, but I regret that I missed the email by which he sent it to all senators. So I thank the Honourable Senator through you, Madam President. I have to confess that I'm in a blur as to which day of the week we actually are at and what time of day it is. All that I do know is that I'm in this house, in this chamber, be it House or Senate, for quite long periods at a time. So I share Honourable Senators' concerns that our debates may be difficult at times to manage. I wish to put on the record to Honourable Senators that the interruptions are not intended in any difficult way to throw you off track, but it's just very difficult to hear the same argument repeatedly. Madam President, there have been a few very crystallized issues that need to be responded to. I hear the exhortations of learned senators on the opposition bench. And whilst I do agree that the Senate bench provides for a great degree of work and for reflection, regrettably, this is not the same position in both houses, and therefore one has to take it the way it comes. I note the exhortations from Senator Haynes that there should be no public relations tool, and then she goes on to give us the advice as the PRO of the UNC. So I don't quite know which way to go with Senator Haynes. Is it hot or is it cold? Do I take the advice or do I not? It's rather interesting to hear advice come from that particular perspective. But I thank the Honourable Senator for trying to make a point of it. I think in round, we can probably say that the issues concern A, whether there was consultation, B, certain legal issues which between Senator Hosein and Senator Ramdeen, I think were quite pointed. And those legal issues concern, firstly, whether there is a degree of entrenchment in respect of the terms and conditions of the officers to carry out the functionality of the land tribunal. Secondly, whether there's a form of equity or equality in treatment of persons who may be argued to be in similar circumstances as it relates to adverse possession between the private lands, adverse possession route, and documentation of title, and that of persons on state lands. Thirdly, as to whether there was any form of turpitude to be found in the reference to the summons aspect and the compellability and the person calling the summons having the power to treat with the summons, and therefore whether one could argue that a right of privacy is being intruded upon in that particular regard. I think those are the three solid legal issues that have been raised so far. Senator Mark, in what is almost a prescribed and fixed formula, started off with there's been a lack of consultation. I beg to differ. In fact, I've referred to the fact that the Law Association in particular was the only entity that actually stood and replied to the suite of laws that we had put out, and their observations have in fact been put into this bill. Senator Haynes has made the point that the key in law is really not only what you pass, but in what you operationalize. Senator Rambharat pointed out the very hard work in the 5th Republican Parliament by then Attorney General Ramesh Lawrence Maharaj. And if I remember, is it 109 bills that were, 92 bills that were on the order paper. The vast majority of them have not seen the light of day, however. They stand unassented to, unproclaimed. Some even died or lapsed. But certainly there was a genuine intention to do work, as Mr. Ramesh Lawrence Maharaj is known as a workhorse in his own right. But I want to just address one point Senator Haynes made as to the assent of other laws, because there's a proclamation clause feature into this. For the record, the laws require confirmation by the stakeholders that they can be proclaimed, plea bargaining, bail amendments, etc. We have written to stakeholders, and the Prisons Authority has asked us to hold our hand while they complete their last bit of training so that we can operationalize the laws. So don't for one moment think that we don't agitate for the proclamation and that we shall in fact proclaim. Madam President, Senator Mark asked that the order made by the Minister to declare an adjudication area, he reflected that that should receive parliamentary scrutiny and should be made subject to affirmative resolution of Parliament. Back to the prescribed formula and approach that Senator Mark says. Consultation, affirmative resolution, joint select committee, we shall not support. It's almost a formula of approach that the Honourable Senator adopts. I remind that Section 3.1 of the Act is not in fact being amended by the Land Adjudication Bill before us, and therefore Senator Mark's observations are outside the fulminations of this Honourable Senate. Senator Mark asked that we take note of his point of view that the Minister responsible for land adjudication was not clear. I'd just like to point out that the Minister with responsibility for this bill will in fact be a Minister gazetted by the designation by the Prime Minister. And I want to point out something because it's arisen in the contributions of Senator Amin, Senator Mark, and I think Senator Obika. It was hard to discern the points made by Senator Obika at times, but I commend him on trying to at least put forward an argument. But the point as to where this bill will be located, how this act will be operationalized, has been something which in effect has stood in 18 years of understanding. And I say this way. In 1999, when these bills came, when this act came into effect in just a couple of months later in the year 2000, and in the fulminations on the 5 attempts previous to this bill to actually get this thing operating, the understanding by the United National Congress, by the People's National Movement, the two governments in power at the respective periods, as recently as in the period 2010 to 2015, is that the land adjudication package would work as an insulated entity within the inside of a ministry. No different from the Commissioner of State Lands in the independent operation there, no different from the Financial Intelligence Unit in the infrastructure coming from the Ministry of Finance, but having the prescriptions and positions for insulation. So the gazetting will specify who the minister is. It's for that reason that Senator Ramdeen's recommendation that we take an extra precautionary step to insulate the functioning officers has found favor with the government. I think it's an excellent submission. I think that we can improve the positions by adding on a level of prescription similar to that found in the Constitution, which is that terms and conditions should never be derogated, that you cannot amend them to the detriment or derogation of terms and conditions which apply. So I think that there's a lot of merit in that submission, and it's certainly something which we shall propose in committee stage to be adopted. Senator Mark continued by saying that the qualifications of the Deputy Adjudication Officer is not specified in Section 1A. Perhaps Senator Mark was a little tired and perhaps didn't spot that Section 4.1b sets out the qualifications. I read it into the record. 1b says a Deputy Adjudication Officer shall be an attorney at law, at least 10 years experience in conveyancing, and shall be appointed by the Judicial and Legal Services Commission. I regret Senator Mark is not here to take notes of these things so that we can avoid a repetition of the issue in the committee stage. Senator Mark also said that with respect to Clause 4 of the bill, which amends Section 4 of the Act, he noted his observation is what are the qualifications of the demarcation officers, assistant adjudication officers, and the survey officers. And again, perhaps Senator Mark didn't spot it, but I'll put it on the record for him for when he returns. Section 4.9 in fact sets out the qualifications of the demarcation officers, assistant officers, and the survey officers. Demarcation officer and a survey officer shall be a Trinidad and Tobago land surveyor within the meaning of it under the Land Surveyors Act, and that's clearly set out at Section 4.9 of the Parent Act. There is, of course, perhaps a misunderstanding on Senator Mark's part. Sure.
Repealed and replaced?
Sure, thanks. I was going to address it under your submissions. Okay. It's not being repealed and replaced. It still stands as part of the Act.
Okay.
So Section 4.9 is being maintained into the Act. There are, of course, and perhaps Senator Mark got it wrong when he was asking for this, for the Assistant Adjudication Officer, this bill proposes that we no longer have references to Assistant Adjudication Officers in the Act. The position is, in fact, being removed from the organizational structure. So I regret that Senator Mark failed to appreciate that that is what the bill is, in fact, doing. Senator Mark went on to address the fact, as he put it, that we have a system established in the country under the State Land Regularization of Tenure Act of 1998, and he asked whether these systems are running in parallel. And I want to point out that, and it was raised by a couple other senators as well, the State Lands Regularization of Tenure Act, from which we get the well-known instrument, the well-known document called a Certificate of Comfort, and then there's a process to flow from that. That is still a feature to be maintained. And in fact, this adjudication bill, the Adjudication Act, allows for the production of documentary evidence, and this Certificate of Comfort is in fact the type of documentary evidence that can still be brought forward in assisting in Section 16 of the Parent Act in the documentation of title, albeit on a provisional basis for the consideration of the tribunal. So the systems will in fact be concurrent. There's no implied repeal intended. There's not intended to be any extinguishing of the provisions of that law. In any event, it must be borne in mind that the State Land Regularization of Tenure Act has been repeatedly portrayed by perhaps predecessor members of the UNC benches, and by some of them, but not members in this House, as some magic wand. I must remind that the Certificate of Comfort does not give documentary title. It does not give title to land. What it in fact failed to do, the Adjudication Act can in fact perfect. In the round, by having an adjudication process, bringing forward the documentary title of evidence of documentary support, such as the Certificate of Comfort, feed it into the adjudication matrix, take it to a land tribunal, and then have your rights considered as to whether your provisional titling can be in fact converted to an absolute title. Madam Speaker, Madam President, Clause 11 of the bill was reflected upon by Senator Mark. Senator Mark noted that the adjudication officer will be recording title in the name of the state. He asked, what does record title mean? He said that there was a conflict because one person is given title while another is not. An amendment should be made to paragraph C to give persons absolute title. And Clause 11, of course, refers to Section 16 of the Act. This is something that Senator Ramdeen also discussed, but Senator Ramdeen's submission was a very sharp one, which was significantly clearer than that raised by Senator Mark. So perhaps, I wouldn't be pejorative, but I think that Senator Ramdeen has the benefit of being a practicing attorney at law who could focus the issue in a slightly different way. But I understood Senator Mark's point to relate to what I can call the equality of treatment argument. I think that it is meritorious that we do some surgery to this particular Section 16, which Clause 11 treats with. In Section 16, Clause 11 proposes in subsection C, a person who, without a documentary title, is in open and peaceable possession of a parcel of state land and has been in such possession, whether by himself or through his predecessors in title, for a period of 30 years or more, he shall record the title in the name of the state. Now, Senator Mark went off on a huge tangent over here, made a bit of a song and dance on it. But let me explain the rationale as to why this is not, in fact, a mistake, and Section 16C, as proposed by Clause 11, is in fact correct. We intend that if you are on state land and you've been there for more than a prescriptive period, you've been there for more than 30 years, that the recording officer, because that's what the adjudication officer is, that the recording officer simply note those facts, record those facts, send it to the land tribunal, and then have the land tribunal treat with that. And that is the formulation that the Act itself prescribes. And that is to be found in the new subsection 2 to section 16, which clause 11 promotes, which is where an adjudication officer records title in the name of the state under 1C or E, he shall serve notice on the adverse possessor, that is the person claiming, and the commissioner of state lands. And then in subclause 3, an adverse possessor of state lands under subsections 1C or E may apply to the land tribunal in the prescribed manner for a vesting order. So we say, if you're on the land for more than 30 years, you've met the prescriptive period, take that to the adjudication officer. The adjudication officer simply records the facts. That is then put by way of notification to both the state and the person claiming adverse possession. And then that matter can be taken to the tribunal, and then the tribunal treats with provisional title going to absolute title. Where I found merit in Senator Ramdeen's submission is in his reflection upon a part of the Act which we were not treating with, and that's in the private land scenario. Now, of course, in the private land scenario, you're saying a person who without documentary title is in open and peaceable possession of a parcel of land other than a parcel of state land and has been in such possession, whether by himself or through his duly authorized agent or his predecessors in title for a period of 16 years or more. We amended it from 30 because 30 was clearly wrong. Private lands, the prescriptive period is 16 years. The officer shall declare the title in such person to be absolute and record it as such. Successive governments from 1999 to 2018 maintain that formula of saying, look, if you're on private land, we'll allow the recording officer to record you as the owner. And let's see why. We took that approach because factually, the state and private land ownership is quite different. The state has thousands of acres unsupervised by a few officers, some of whom have allegations of corruption against them, some of whom may just don't care to turn up to work. Let's be honest about what we're dealing with. And therefore, the state was given a longer prescriptive period. The state was given a whole extra amount of time to object. But the state was told, look, instead of the recording officer recording you as absolute title under the state lands, let's treat with private lands differently, because the system of adjudication operates such that you go into an area so declared. It's subdivided as will be declared. Notices are blitzed all around Trinidad and Tobago. The area is seasoned to be aware that title is going to be looked at. They start by looking at the Real Property Ordinance or Act land. They then move on to documentary title. These things are possessed. We send out notices. We have a feature in the Adjudication Act that says if you have the suspicion that somebody didn't turn up but you think they should, the officer must act that way. And therefore it was more reasonable than not to conclude that the private landowner would be aware of the situation and could intervene. Now, the balancing act that I imagine governments prior to this one and this government had to and still do factor, do we overload a tribunal? Do we send everything to the tribunal, all adverse possession? Now, Senator Ramdeen hit that issue square on the head. I think it's an excellent point to pull out into the fore of our consideration. And in considering the issue and in discussing it with members of the cabinet this morning prior to getting here, we considered the point from a policy point of view and felt, well, perhaps there's merit in the argument that this land adjudication process will be large on the front end but very small on the tail end. Because as you move past an adjudication area and you settle that piece, you move to another and you move to another. I think that there is merit in this submission made by Senator Ramdeen that we should in fact send the private lands to the adjudication process via the tribunal as well. And so the government will propose at the committee stage that we send all disputes in respect of adverse possession, whether in respect of state land or in respect of private land, to the tribunal. All that it will mean is that the government has the extra burden, and it should exercise that conditionality to provide the necessary support and manpower for the exercise. Or that you treat with the zones in a different way. You go on a smaller zone and on a faster ruling basis. You see, in Trinidad and Tobago, we have the benefit now of a significant amount of technology which has been purchased and paid for by the taxpayers of this country. And I'm referring to the Cadastral Information Management System. I'm also referring to the GIS system and the land registration system, which the Office of the Attorney General and Ministry of Legal Affairs is deep in. That is, of course, bolstered by the IDB funding for $100 million and also for $7 million. I note Senator Mark's request now that we must lay these documents on the table. I remind Senator Mark that these IDB documents have been in care and control of Trinidad and Tobago's public sector, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planning, since 2008. And I find it curious that Senator Mark is now making this recommendation when under the UNC there were 2 bills brought in near exact fashion, and there was absolutely no cry or call for the laying of documents in Parliament and table now, and we must have transparency and affirmative resolution. This new version of Senator Mark is quite an interesting version of the UNC's perspectives. No, thank you. Not just yet. Let me finish this point. Just a moment, I'll give way in a second. So, Madam President, I think that there's merit in this point. Before, I didn't want to go off of Senator Mark's contributions because there's more to traverse, but I want to deal with the animus possidendi argument that Senator Ramdeen has pointed out and that Senator Hosein has reflected upon. I thank Senator Ramdeen again for the provision of the case law. We agree that Pi Oxford is in fact locus classicus, as well as adopted most recently by our own High Court and reflected by our Court of Appeal. I remind that there's a balancing act here. The provisions of Section 16 of the Act, which Clause 11 reflects upon, have a formula which says a person who without documentary title is in open and peaceable possession. And that's repeated for private lands and for state lands. And when we're treating with that, I had a look at the Real Property Act. And Senator Hosein made the submission that the Real Property Act, which is prescriptive, should be followed. I remind Senator Hosein that we have the opportunity via Section 27 of the Parent Act, the Land Adjudication Act, to put in the same regulations and to flesh out the process. I don't think that we need to be prescriptive at this point. It's by far better to allow it a more flexible approach as we have under the RPA. I can tell you now the regulations are ready. So we're going to treat with the regulations shortly. But I took note of Section 49 of the Real Property Act, Chapter 5602, and in Section 49, it says, a person who claims that he has acquired title by possession of land under the provisions of this Act. What happened with Senator Ramdeen flag, and of course that's related to Form E of the RPA Act, what happened was that the courts then went into the judicial interpretation of what in fact adverse possession meant or possession meant, and it is truly the case that adverse possession is a bifurcated position. On the first limb, you need to have the fact of possession, and on the second limb, the intention of possession or the animus possidendi. I think that we can, in fact, avoid a whole lot of debate as to whether we've reset the law. Certainly that was the position which happened in the United Kingdom when they made their 1925 amendments and their 1980 amendments. And therefore, we think that there is room to improve the intention of the possessor inside of the language for both Section 16B and Section 16C. And we can actually put in the formula of wording which says, with the intention to dispossess. And therefore that would satisfy the animus possidendi being on an express basis as opposed to an implied basis, and it wouldn't invite a court to consider whether Parliament, quote unquote, in its wisdom, sought to reset the law to just mere possession. That was not the intention here. the language which came forward and which successive governments have brought forward really fell upon the sort of formulation that the Real Property Act had, in particular in Section 49, as assisted by Form E of that particular piece of law. Senator Mark made reference to regulations to clarify procedure in the Act. I remind that the regulations can be made subsequently, and they're in fact ready to be proceeded with. Senator Mark said that paragraph C seeks to address adverse possession. There's no definition of adverse possession. No definition is in fact required. It's a term of law. It has been well traversed in our jurisdiction, and there's no need to be prescriptive in that regard. Senator Mark says specific provisions should be made for procedures to obtain title as an adverse possessor. This procedure, of course, is set out in Section 16.3. Perhaps Senator Mark didn't reflect upon that. And the Land Tribunal can, of course, further prescribe the powers and procedures for Land Tribunal, but that's under a different bill, and I don't want to be running afoul of the rule against anticipation. Senator Ramkissoon addressed a very interesting point. What happens to people in the declared zones, if I can call it that way, environmentally sensitive, forest reserves, etc.? And Senator Rambharat and I were having a fair amount of discussion in a sort of a pre-LRC and LRC context as to the state's future plans and how we treat with that. I remind that when we're looking at Section 7 of the Act, that's the Principal Act, and we look to the subsections 1A and B, is declared to be a protected area and is declared to be an environmentally sensitive area under the EMA Act. First one under the Forest Act, second one under the Environmental Management Act. We have room there to massage what else comes into there and what else can be removed out of there. And that's to be dealt with under these separate pieces of law, which is the Forests Act and the Environmental Management Act. But Senator Ramkissoon's question as to what happens with the people there, I think has been properly well traversed by Senator Rambharat. And in my winding up, I adopt his submissions, because this government intends that there will always be consultation. Land being a very finite resource in this country's perspective has to be properly managed. So the issue of what happens to people on these lands is already prescribed by law. It's the existing law. The Commissioner of State Lands would receive the reference. The rules against occupation or the enforceability of the state rights will be considered. But successive governments have just left the issue alone. Because you have to have a lot of political guts to treat with this issue. And that is the truth. Whether this government, by this law, intends to do something by way of disturbance is not on in this case. We are affirming the existing law. We're repeating it into the provisions of this act if it becomes amended as such. But what has to happen with people's lives and their homes, etc., is a matter of consultation and a matter of propriety, which this government can assure it will always maintain. That is, simply put, that there is always the room for consultation and management, but that the state must have the right to treat with its reserves and with its environmentally sensitive areas, its aquifers, its forestry areas. It's not an easy subject. Senator Ramkissoon also asked about Section 4, dealing with the demarcation officers and subsection 8B. She made reference in her argument that it didn't specify what time period the court will mandate for an officer to enter premises with the permission of the court. Well, obviously, that is to be dealt with by the court making its own determination, because a court makes determinations and prescriptions as to the manner in which its order should be made certain, depending upon the circumstances of each and every case, as it may be different from another. Senator Ramkissoon also reflected upon Clause 20, which dealt with consequential amendments. Senator Ramkissoon asked us to note that in her submission, we were changing the language to allow for more adjudication officers, but that Sections 16 and 20 were not amended as these other clauses were, and she sought clarification as to whether this is intentional or an oversight. The government's position is quite simple. The amendment to Section 16 is contained in Clause 11. There is no reference to an adjudication officer in Section 20 of the Act. So I think that we got it right, Senator Ramkissoon, in our reflections. Senator Ramdeen, I've dealt with some of his submissions. I dealt with the fact that adverse possession, from Senator Mark's perspective, he had invited us to put a description. I think Black's Law Dictionary and our own jurisprudence traverses that quite well. We've dealt with the disparity between the state land adverse possessor route versus the private land adverse possessor route. We submit that we will propose an amendment to treat with that by sending them both to the Land Tribunal. We propose that we, in fact, add an express terminology to language to cover the mental intention of possession to meet with the Pye and Oxford, the Pye-Oxford case, and that we will add in the words with the intention to defeat the documentary title. We come next to the submission as to salary and remuneration and anchoring that down. We propose to adopt the formula of expressly stating that the salary, remuneration, allowances, and other conditions of the chairman, deputy chairman, other members of the tribunal, and lay assessors shall not be altered to their disadvantage after the appointment and duration of their tenure of office. So, Madam President, I think that we have pretty much hit the big cornerstone issues raised in this debate. And I'd like to remind the Honorable Senate, this land package, this particular bill, is intended to treat with the most scarce of resources in our country. The land adjudication process is intended to facilitate the reversal of what exists in our current law. Under the Real Property Act, the burden is upon the claimant in the court process to take advantage of the provisions under Part 4 of the Real Property Act to make an application which he or she pays for under the provisions of Section 49 of the Real Property Act to go through a judicial process. In the land adjudication exercise, we propose that the state bear that responsibility and cost. We propose that the state manage the process entirely. We have proposed amendments to take us into avoiding constitutional pitfalls. We have proposed for a disaggregation of the executive mind away from the functionality of this. We have obtained loan and financing backing from the IDB in this particular structure. We have the GIS information, the cadastral information management system ready and waiting for implementation. We have improved the resources at the land registry. We intend to physically move the land registry, completing that exercise by September of this year. The improved IT and technology have already been factored into that equation. We have entered upon an exercise of registration at our registry and computerization and digitization. That exercise involves 5.8 million pages of documents. We have opened up the RPA online system, the journals, the books, etc. Almost 80,000 documents running. We're tightening the IT structures to allow for fraud to be removed from the situation by encrypted end-to-end management between attorneys at law and the registry, etc. And therefore, Madam President, 2018, June 2018, the 7th of June 2018, is perhaps a very auspicious day to allow us to get out of analysis paralysis and to allow us to operationalize laws which are, in fact, on the books of Trinidad and Tobago and have stood without an ability for action for a full 18-year period. Yes, sir.
Could you advise us when would the accompanying regulations be tabled before we operationalize these measures?
I expect to be able to treat with those regulations in or around September of this year. They're finished already. So they'll go through the pre-LRC and LRC process just for compatibility and double-checking aspects. We have them ready. We want to finish the rest of the land package. I'll remind that I've already indicated and expressed publicly that we will be bringing interim measures to treat with our land registration system, because this package is a long-term situation which will take a number of years to be fully perfected. And in doing that interim measure, some of the regs are going to be managed as well. So we have that full work product ready. We've gone out to consultation on that. We've completed consultation. We've factored the feedback into that, so we intend to be moving with alacrity on this particular matter. It's, of course, tied into our local government reform. And I'm very pleased to say that our land management and local government reform, we have, in fact, come to the end of the legislative process for that. We intend to have that on the table very shortly. I expect at the end of this week to be able to manage that process. So, Madam President, I think we're making good steps. I invite this particular Senate to be a participant in promoting the advancement of Trinidad and Tobago. I'm very open to receiving submissions in the committee stage, and I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Land Adjudication Act 2000 be now read a second time. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
Titled An Act to Amend the Land Adjudication Act 2000.
Attorney General.
Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 66-1, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Land Adjudication Act 2000 be committed to a committee of the whole Senate forthwith to be considered clause by clause.
Honourable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Land Adjudication Act 2000 be committed to a committee of the whole Senate forthwith to be considered clause by clause. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The Senate shall now go into committee of the whole to consider the bill clause by clause. Honourable Senators, there are 20 clauses in this bill. I believe amendments are being circulated now on behalf of the Attorney General. Am I correct, Attorney General? Yes, ma'am. Yes. And is there another set of amendments? Senator Mark?
Yes, we have a set of amendments being typed by the office here, and we are yet to see them. So with your leave, I would ask if we could probably
okay, so here's what we will do. I will take the break at this time, and we will come back. Yeah, we'll come back at 5:20. Hopefully those amendments will be ready and circulated, because I would like us to start the committee proceedings as soon as I come back. So the Attorney General is craving my indulgence.
No, I support him.
He seems to think that I have a generous spirit.
Yes. Yeah,
so we will come back at 5:30.
I support him, yeah.
Okay?
Yes,
so we are suspended until
no,
5:30.